If I can prove that there's better justification for my hypothesis, and my hypothesis, if true, falsifies yours, then who's decided is who has more justification. So your justification is, I've read the literature, take my word for it. My justification is, I've spoken to you, and I know you don't know the literature. You just know individual arguments that you spoon-fed out of Jack's dick. Evidence too. I've seen inductively many people bent to Jack's will. Okay, I've even seen people converted out of theism, like Danny bent to Jack's will. Josh, fucking most of those guys, Yuri, etc., bent to Jack's will. I also know the causal history of the views and how they were acquired. Jack held those views before anyone else. They came with other views. They had a meeting of the minds, and Jack bent them to his will. And why? Because Jack knew more about philosophy than them, knew more about the distinctions, and they had no chance. Okay, and so there's the evidences right there. Now, if those are well supported evidences, okay, then it's a better explanation than your hypothesis. Okay.
Well, so that's the second time you fucked up, because the first time you tried to float the idea that I was reading some 50-page assignment from Jack. That was wrong. That's Yuri. The second time you tried to say Danny was no longer a theist. That's wrong. He still identifies as a theist. So that's two fuck-ups there. Excuse me, I'm not done, right? That's two fuck-ups there. Your burden was to show you had disconfirmatory evidence for my hypothesis. You provided no such evidence. You just restated your claim and gave the evidence you provided earlier, which I've already countered with a competing hypothesis that I've justified. There's no reason to say that my evidence is just take my word for it, when that's basically what you're suggesting for your hypothesis. So the claim's unjustified.
Well, no, I think his position was just not to disconfirm yours, but to make his more probable. But I mean, I've been in the server for quite a while, but I kind of float in the background.
We explained that the only way he's going to show that there's more justification for his hypothesis is if he...
So I've been in like...
Well, this guy literally...
I don't know why you're
because he joined 10 seconds ago and is running interference.
No. I just wanted to clarify something, or just put out a point that I think favors what Shamos is saying, at least.
Well, I'm just going to completely ignore what you...
That's fine. But the idea is that it's not just the arguments that I notice that people adopt that leads me to believe that a lot of people merely adopt Jack's view for the reasons that Shamos put about, but it's the language they use, it's the sentence structure, it's the connotation. I noticed that a lot of people, especially in those circles, adopt all of that and follow, and you can almost preemptively tell who they've spoken to or who their influences are based on how they engage in that.
Right.
So, I do believe that Shamos has a point in there, in that sense, but I'm also happy to concede that Pogan's a relatively smart guy and that he can consider arguments for himself, even if it is the case that certain psychological traits or even linguistic tendencies are adopted from people that he respects. I don't think there's a problem with that necessarily.
Well, two things. I don't need to disconfirm Pogan's view in order to give a competing hypothesis that's got better explanatory power and more justification.
Right.
Also, there's something interesting to note. Pogan offered his competing hypothesis as a defeater to my view, right? He was saying, look, if this hypothesis is true, then that's a defeater to your view. Isn't it the same true that if my hypothesis is true, that's a defeater to your view? You've already agreed that they both couldn't be true. So it's not just saying like, look, I presented an altered hypothesis with some justification, and therefore that's a defeater to your view. No, my view, if it has more justification, is a defeater to your view. And so I don't have to provide a defeater to your view. In fact, if you think you've provided a defeater to mine, then by necessity I've provided one.
Yeah, right now you're just bullshitting, right? Do you have reason to disconfirm my hypothesis, or do you not?
You disconfirm my hypothesis just by positing an alternative hypothesis, but that was competing, right? So you disconfirm mine by putting forward a competing hypothesis.
Well, can I explain what I understood?
So you agree my hypothesis is competing. Can't I disconfirm yours by putting forward my hypothesis? Duh, motherfucker.
Yeah.
The idea is...
I still don't understand what Shamos' evidence is. And why it's like more
so to try to recast like both views, it seemed like to me that Shamos was making
the evidence that Shamos would proffer would be like reasons to believe his thing, which means that there would be like explanatory virtues his hypothesis has. But I'm not like seeing what explanatory virtues his hypothesis has.
Well, so I think
that's not
that
even
Shamos
relevant to
was
what we're
trying
talking
to.
about now.
Shamos was trying to argue for a high prior on the basis of other people in the community. So if we take at random somebody in the community, he's trying to make an argument that such a random person has a higher chance than not of being converted by Jack if it is the case that they hold to Marxism. Or whatever it was that was in contention.
Let me
hold on. Let me expand the other part. And I took the way in which Pogan was providing a competing hypothesis to be with respect to certain data, where that certain data was the fact that he had a belief revision. And Shamos was using that data of a belief revision to argue for his hypothesis that it was as a result of Jack. But Pogan, the way in which he was, quote unquote, defeating that view was by providing a competing explanatory hypothesis for the data of his conversion or his, change of view. And so the way in which Shamos, you should understand Pogan, is that he was providing a competing explanation for the data of his conversion. And so that's why there's kind of a stalemate, unless it is the case that you can bring other evidence to bear, because they would equally explain the conversion.
I'm making a slightly more nuanced point.
This is why Cam's...
What I'm saying is
This is why I've been reiterating.
That's I was trying
for 15 minutes that
elucidate.
There would need to be disconfirmatory evidence targeting my view to further substantiate his hypothesis, none of which has been provided.
Yes, but
so right now we're
if my
basically just
hypothesis is justified, it's a disconfirmatory. Let me see if I can explain it to Cam really quick. Okay, so what he's saying is he's offered disconfirmatory evidence against my hypothesis by offering a competing hypothesis. That is a hypothesis that couldn't simultaneously be true with I'm talking to Cam. A hypothesis that couldn't simultaneously be true with my hypothesis, right? And then he offered some justification for that hypothesis, okay? And so what he's saying is, if I've justified this hypothesis, and this hypothesis couldn't simultaneously be true with your hypothesis, then I've offered disconfirmation of your hypothesis, in effect by justifying a competing hypothesis, right? Now,
yeah, so I would agree that if that was the way the whole sort of situation was being characterized, then it probably is not the language I would choose. I took him by disconfirmatory.
Don't you agree that if my theory is competing, then my theory, if justified, is a disconfirmation of his. So he hasn't provided any more disconfirmation or less than I provided. I provided a competing hypothesis with justification. He's provided a competing hypothesis with justification. What I'm arguing is that I've offered a competing hypothesis that is more justified and is a better explanation of the facts. That's what I'm saying. And so it isn't like he's defeated my view, and I don't, and it doesn't matter until I can offer disconfirmation of his, because he's already agreed in essence that if it's a competing hypothesis and I've offered justification, then that's reasons that is a defeater for his view, or whatever the word he was using.
Yeah, I understood what he was saying there to be okay, this evidence that you thought was evidence for your claim is no longer working for your claim only, but it's also working for my claim because my hypothesis is competitive over that same data. That's what I understood him to be saying. I might have misinterpreted it.
We don't have the same data. You keep in mind, my data, my background information is not the same data he's using. I'm using information that Jack has done this to many other people before. I know the causal history of beliefs.
Right, and that's why
Jack didn't acquire their beliefs. They acquired Jack's belief. Jack held the beliefs previous. Jack knew more about philosophy. And so we're not, look, so his don't explain those facts. His, in fact, don't even touch those facts. My hypothesis explains all of those facts and his fucking behavior.
Well, that's why I characterize what you were doing as arguing for a prior. And I thought that you were doing it. It doesn't bear directly on Pogan as an individual, but it raises the prior probability that any random individual have been influenced in the way that you described.
How do we know this isn't confirmation bias?
Look, if you think Pogan has similar features to the same people that were bent to his will, then it's the sample's representative, right? And so we could generalize from that sample.
The whole view seems to come down to an accusation. Well, maybe I shouldn't say the whole view, but of substance, it seems to be there's some type of accusation about Pogan's honesty with respect to his belief revision process. And so the subject of discussion is about Pogan being an honest individual or something like that.
No. I don't think
maybe
that's what the claim is. I'm not calling into his question his honesty or his integrity. All I'm saying was he ran into someone that knew more about philosophy than him, and his intellectual
you said
superior.
that he hadn't read the literature when he claims that he has.
Okay, well, I claim with respect to that fact, he's not being honest, but not in what I'm speaking of here. Yeah, of course he's not being honest with respect to that fact. I don't think he's read the literature at all. In fact, what I take it was when someone's read the literature is when they start with they read it more broadly. They don't just look at a couple individual arguments for certain views. They've start out with an introduction to meta-ethics, go on to read more about the field, could tell you about all the views: individual subjectivism, moral relativism, cultural relativism, moral realism, non-naturalism, naturalism, moral, could describe you all the positions, quasi-realism, et cetera, emotivism, universal prescriptivism, and literally understands all the positions and could even rattle off 2 or 3 arguments for each position. All the Blackburn posited quasi-realism and Blackburn justification for this. J.L. Mackie posited error theory, and these were his famous arguments. One's called the argument from queerness, and one's called the argument from moral discretion. None of those things. That's what it means to be acquainted with the literature. Okay, Pogan comes in here and he knows specific arguments about semantic realism. He knows a couple different arguments about. He doesn't know the broad literature. It isn't like he's read all the things on what it means to be there to be content. Read the arguments for internalism, externalism, blah blah blah. He's read a couple ones.
You're going for a really long time, and you're saying so much that it's not really going to be possible for an individual person to respond to it. But just to go back a little bit, I think that the original contention was about Marxism, right? Now you're talking about a whole variety of other views that Pogan may or may not have. So maybe we either finish the Marxism thing, or maybe it's part of a wider case.
Pogan
maybe you're trying to say, maybe you're trying to say that Pogan as a whole, his belief revision is explained by this one hypothesis.
Never about Marxism.
This was always about the aggregate of Pogan's beliefs. It wasn't about
this was never about Marxism. Okay. This was about all of the beliefs that Pogan has acquired from Jack. Okay, Marxism, content externalism, external value properties, Villgrammi's view on compatibilism, all this bullshit. He knows about Villgrammi's view on compatibilism. Does he know has he read the literature on compatibilism as a whole? Has he read Carl Ginnett? Has he read David Lewis? Has he fucking read Robert Kane? Has he read Peter Van Inwagen? Fuck no. He isn't familiar with the literature. This motherfucker is the opposite of familiar with the literature.
So reading all those people constitutes being familiar with literature?
What was that?
Does reading all of those authors constitute being familiar with the literature?
Yeah, I mean, at least having knowledge of those authors, their positions, their arguments, etc. Yeah, that's really important. It's really important.
When you say to be familiar with literature, it's just to be aware of their positions and their arguments and their thoughts, not to have read the direct material.
It's not about knowing a couple individual arguments in a certain field, right? It's about knowing about the field as a whole, its divisions, its distinctions, who's proposed the arguments, what the classical arguments refer, what the modern defenders were. That's what I take it to mean, that someone's acquainted with the literature. When someone comes in and is just acquainted with a few arguments for a certain position, they're not aware of the landscape of that area of philosophy. That isn't familiar with the literature at all. I could tell you straight up, I'm familiar with the literature in meta-ethics. I could go through, tell you all of the distinctions, the necessary conditions to be a moral realist, necessary conditions to be a non-moral realist, et cetera, et cetera. I could go through detail every single one of the positions, how they cash out their views semantically, who were their initial proponents, okay, in some of the arguments that they propose. I could do that with literally every single fucking view there is. There's 15 of them or more. That's what it means to be acquainted with the literature.
That's going to be irrelevant to what he said, though, because what he means is that he's read enough of the literature to convince him of certain subjects.
Yeah, it seems like when you say familiar with literature,
like every time you get into these discussions, Shamos, you just want to change what people are saying entirely, make it something else.
right?
No,
I think
no.
like people who would
Yeah,
hear
I do
your
discourage
account,
that practice.
and it seems like when people hear your account of being familiar with literature, they might go away thinking, "Oh, by familiar with literature, Shamos means be well educated in this field." And I don't think people tend to think those concepts are synonymous with each other.
Also, I
don't
think
think
it's okay
I don't think
to,
it would be
like,
reasonable
have
for a
read
person to
some-
think that's what being acquainted with the literature meant. On Pogan's view, I don't think it's reasonable for them to think that's what it means.
Like, I would respect the scenario where Pogan hadn't read as comprehensively as you suggest he needs to meet that claim of being familiar with the literature. But I would take it to be like a completely normal thing for him to have his views changed by some form of engagement with literature. And like, I don't think that it's the case that you have to read the literature comprehensively before you have any shift in your views. Now, it might be that somebody points out to you some important part that you've missed, or like an author who argues well against a position that you currently hold. But this comprehensiveness condition, I think, is a little bit difficult.
I think there's another way that we could attack it, right? How many of you just think, okay, based on what you know about Pogan, what you know about Jack, what you know about all the discussions they've been having, what do you think is the case? Do you think that either Jack said, maybe you should read this type of stuff, blah, 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 and then Pogan went away, opened the book or opened the PDF file, read it, came back and said, now my view's been changed, without ever speaking to Jack at all about the issues? Or do you think what actually has happened is Jack has rattled off the arguments, okay, left and right. Pogan doesn't know a response to any of it, okay, and that's what convinced him. Okay,
Well,
you really think that he just went and read and just came back every time and was like,
yeah,
I think
Jack,
I came back, I read the literature, and my views are changed. Guess what, Jack? I read the literature again, and my views are changed, and they're just the same as yours.
There's a third option.
How come every time he reads the literature, he takes the same view as Jack? That's a good question. Let's just answer that one. If he reads the literature and comes to his own conclusion, why does he always have the same view as Jack when he gets done?
Let other people talk.
Answer that one question and I'll be done. Answer that one question, I'll be done. I promise.
Okay.
Answer that one question.
I swear to God. There's a third option, right? Which is he reads and then talks to Jack as he reads. So the distinction that you're pointing out is either Jack tells him or he only reads. Seems to be one of those, I know you don't like the word dichotomy, but seems like yet another dichotomy where he could be reading and talking.
It wasn't proposed as a dichotomy. You could just say, which one do you think better explains Pogan change in behavior, right?
Well, the way
I'm also inclined to... I'm also.
No one ever answered my question, and I remember I was so honest about just getting an answer to that.
I can answer it. The only plausible, the only answer that I could give that would explain the same thing, but not give your conclusion, is the idea that Jack's views are actually right, and the literature he recommends is compelling for good reason.
Yeah.
Well, I have another option, and I think this is more likely. It is the case that Pogan is a needy bastard. He needs recognition and acknowledgement. Now he sees in Jack this person who is recognized in the community. He has this authority figure, right? and it could be the case that Pogan read what or is aware of what Jack's positions are, and he wants to impress him, and then search for his own, looking for the whatever, right? In order for him to impress Jack and say, oh, this guy is whatever. And I think, but Pogan is looking, is just acknowledgement from Jack that he's a worthy individual who's smart or whatever. And I think that is the case.
So going back to what I was saying earlier, I am inclined to just trust what Pogan says when he says that he was introduced to some of these concepts prior to Jack. I know that he was specifically talking about Marxism there, but maybe if he could enter the discussion again, he would clarify.
I'd be willing to take your alternate hypothesis and find out which one you think is more likely, Cam. Let's just grant. let's just grant that put your hypothesis on the table, that maybe it's just the case that Jack gave him the right literature, right? And it's compelling, okay? And Pogan basically was able to look at it, reason to it similarly to the way that Jack did, and come to the same conclusion. And it's in virtue of the fact that Pogan is a strong reasoner, and then that he saw the exact same things that Jack saw, or something very similar to the things that Jack saw, and the arguments were that good, okay? Now, we could take that hypothesis, okay, that it just really is, Pogan really just understands the argument exactly in the same way that Jack understands them, especially when these arguments, I mean, I've read a lot of this stuff, and I know, I actually have been acquainted with enough philosophy to know that it's never that simple, and that it's always a hard, laborious time trying to get all these things consistent and figure them out. So do you think your view is more likely, or that he was just merely bent to Jack's will because he didn't know anything about philosophy? Jack's been doing it for like 15 years, has really, really good arguments, and Pogan just was unable to resist any of the conclusions because he didn't have the philosophical tools at his disposal to even combat the arguments in a healthy way. I think that's more likely.
So I want to point out something that you did there. I think you made the hypothesis overly specific. You could probably relax that criteria. So you said that the one hypothesis we're comparing against is that he had the precise insights and the precise understanding of the reasoning that Jack had, and that led. But that's not going to be a necessary condition for him coming to believe that the argument's sound, right? He could actually have a different understanding, and it could be still sufficient that he comes to believe that the argument is sound. And this might be because there is some other piece of background knowledge that's different to what Jack's were when he was reading the literature, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think you can give me that.
But I may get a caveat that would either be the way that Jack understood it, or similar to the way Jack understood it, And I mean, I think that, pretty much, I'm not saying that it's completely mutually exclusive, but for the most part, these type of arguments work in such a way that they're kind of exclusive in that sense. It couldn't both be like that. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know if it's helpful to kind of describe it as a hard dichotomy. I think it's perhaps you'd receive it better also if you worded it in a way that suggested that the weight of what contributed to his, let's say, conversion came from direct influence rather than being, let's say, sufficiently acquainted with the literature. And I think he might even be open to that and saying, well, yeah, perhaps I've had more conversations or more time in conversation with Jack than I have actually reading it independently. But then I've sort of used the literature as confirmation. So it seems more combative rather than seeking to understand each other. So I don't know if that's just sport right now, but...
So if some of these arguments, they're really hard, they're really confusing. Like the rule following argument, what makes you think that it's likely that someone presented the rule following argument with on their own devices, just reading it, is just going to come to the same conclusion that Jack does? Which one is very off base, that if there's non-natural sui generis properties, and we already committed that there is meaning and stuff like that. I mean, do you really think someone's going to come to that just on their own? In some of these arguments,
I can at least indicate
complex.
that.
This is what I would say. Last thing I'll say really quickly. Imagine Pogan never met Jack. Never spoke with Jack. Okay? But Jack was allowed, okay, to select all of the literature that Pogan read, right? Or whatever the literature that Pogan read. And then that literature is just shipped to his door. He's never met Jack, and they ask him to read all of those things. What's the likelihood, never ever talking to Jack, that he comes to all of those same views on all of those same topics, okay? How fucking rare do you think that would be, given the complexity of some of these issues, and Pogan was a philosophical lightweight? I think it's literally fucking astronomically impossible, okay? So what the better explanation, if you have that same intuition there, is that it's way more better explained because of his interactions with Jack, and not just his interactions with the literature. What takes primacy in that explanation is his interactions with Jack. That should be super straightforward.
Isn't about just having interactions. The contention is what he finds particularly convincing. Now, having interactions with Jack could be what motivates him to read the literature, which he then finds convincing. Who cares if he has to interact with Jack first?
Yeah, I agree that
I think
could
that
be the case. I'm asking of these two hypotheses, which is more likely.
Very good point.
Thank you. It's there's no reason to think it matters.
Listen, I'm not presenting a dichotomy, so you don't win just by nature of presenting a third option. I'm saying of these two on the table, which is more likely? If you want to offer your third option and say that option's more likely, go right ahead.
There you go.
So why is the third option more likely?
So Jack is already here. Jack has a remarkable ability to reason, of course. So Jack might be more likely to find the more convincing literature for people to read.
Yeah, that's already been proposed. The literature's super complex. No one understands Jerry's Fodor argument against natural selection. No one gets rule following on the first 10 passes. No one fucking gets it.
Jack suggests also reading companions and other people to go over them. For example, he doesn't say, hey, you want to be a Marxist, read Das Kapital. What he recommends is Ernest Mandel's introduction to Marxism, right? Now, that's not direct Marxism right there, but that's what he recommends, and that's very convincing literature for Marxism.
But look, I mean, it's just kind of claimed via fiat that it just must be the case that the literature was more convincing, and the reason why is because Jack selects really good literature. But that's already been put on the. That was the first thing. That's the first thing that Cam put on the table.
No, but I never made the claim that was the actual true hypothesis.
No. He was just saying here's an alternate hypothesis. I don't even think Cam was necessarily endorsing it. What I'm saying it's already been addressed.
Well, I will say, so if you hold on a moment, Shamos, this is nothing at all against Jack or the folks who have been compelled into the same views that he holds. But I will say that I had to practice some self-discipline to avoid getting captured in the web. I did notice during that time that I felt a lot of feelings that were similar to when I attended church and were being socially compelled to believe in Jesus. And I'm not making it I think it's the same.
I like the idea of Jack as Jesus.
The same type of social phenomenon where there are people around you convinced by these things, and they're trying to suggest that you get convinced by them, and you have to be very cautious to really become convinced for the right reasons, not just because people you respect or people not for coherence group thing. And so I've been very reluctant to sort of to shift to make sure that I actually evaluate appropriately. And I'm still not a Marxist, and I'm still not somebody who believes in natural sui generis intentionality. But I've at least found Jack's arguments to be pretty interesting objections to certain views that I have held, and I'm not sure what to make of them yet. In fact, I'm currently engaged with a friend of mine who is in his PhD specifically on the following argument, or what Jack and Josh and that take to be the conclusions of it.
Wait, their thesis is on the rule following?
No. He's working in philosophy.
I have a question for Socrates, but I think I already know the answer given what he said, but I just want to confirm that that's his answer. So you think if Jack selected all of the literature, even the reading companions, anything that goes along with it, like you were saying, even the reading companions, even the companions to the reading companions, he selects it all out for Pogan, a novice, a complete novice in philosophy. And then he goes through and reads all of this high-level, very complex arguments, and reads the reading companions. You think, without ever speaking to Jack, it's likely he would have came to the same views?
I don't understand
that just
the
seems
relevance.
intuitive.
Well,
I mean,
to do with the situation?
If it's in virtue of the fact that he was acquainted with the literature, then, and that's what takes primacy over the explanation, then it seems like absent of Jack, he would have come to those views because what best explains it, he was acquainted by the literature. And so what I'm saying is if he even had the reading pans, he had all those things. As a philosophical novice, approaching some of the hardest arguments in philosophy, literally the rule-following argument, Jerry Fodor's arguments against natural selection, some of this Bill Grommy stuff is super complicated about practical agency, and then he reads all the reading companions as a philosophical novice. You think the philosophical novice is going to come to all Jack's views just in virtue of the fact that he has the literature and the reading companions? No fucking way. That seems intuitively absurd.
No, the
And so
point is
what I'm guessing, the best explanation is not the reading, because he wouldn't have come to it through the reading alone. The best explanation is he sucked it straight out of Jack's dick, just like every other motherfucker that came through the door.
Yeah, but see, that's the problem. Is that seems to be.
Shamos is correct here, guys.
That seems to be too much of a dichotomy there, Shamos. Like, I know that it's rhetorical and hyperbole, but I think that you are almost like undercutting and not allowing for inclusion Pogan's existence as a rational agent. And, you know, obviously we are folks overcome by social biases and, you know, all this type of thing. And we know based on the literature and psychology how much these things do play a role. But I think that, like, you are almost like framing it like an all or nothing. Like, he sucks the views out of Jack's dick.
Shamos is going to say that that's not a dichotomy.
No. I'm also saying it's not a dichotomy.
It would be a dichotomy, right?
So I'm just saying, out of these two, which do you think is a better explanation? Now, if you want to propose another hypothesis and give reasons why it's a better explanation, that's fine. And if you want to blur the lines and say, oh, well, it's a little bit of both. Well, what we should demand for is in the little bit of both, if that's what you want to claim, which one takes primacy, okay? Which one takes primacy? Which one was a stronger influence, okay? And so I think that's a reasonable question to ask, okay? And so, I mean, I would just like to fucking, is Josh here? Godless, are you listening? Is Josh here?
Jack is here. Jack is here.
No, he's sleeping.
Well, okay, Jack isn't honest a lot of times in these places, but sometimes Josh is. I was going to ask if Josh really thought. I would ask Jack this. I'll ask Jack the same question. I'm not very confident that he's going to be honest.
Can we not get into that big giant fucking blow up thing?
What I wanted to know is if Josh really honestly thought that Pogan came to those views in a better and because his acquaintance with the literature, and not in virtue of Jack giving him the arguments and defeating.
No, that's not the right question. The right question is whether he was convinced more by Jack or by the literature, not whether he just encountered them through the literature.
Yeah, the thing that I'm interested in is whether or not, like, the social phenomenon and, like, the fact that like these perhaps like respect or like social hierarchy thing, whether or not that had an influence. I think that's what you're talking about, Shamos. So I don't know. I kind of think about like PhD advisors and PhD candidates, and you know how it often is the case that such candidates become quite influenced by their advisor. Maybe Jack's like a really good PhD advisor.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of those guys that are PhD candidates or whatever and all this stuff have already come through and have a master's degree. Pogan was a philosophical novice when he started going through some super, super complex arguments.
Yeah, and so Shamos, underlying it, you seem to think that there's this really negative thing about Pogan having done that.
Have you guys researched the argument?
Well, no, I was just saying that, like, is it really the case that you think that Jack's views are all right? Or is it just a better explanation that you just didn't know shit about philosophy, didn't have the tools at hand to rebut or even conceptualize the arguments in a robust way, and you couldn't resist any of the inferences, and he just dogged you out?
And I assume
I think that's probably more correct, because I've researched the rule following argument, right, when it was presented to me, simply because I had an antagonism towards Josh, right? So like I looked into it, and there's a bunch of different solves to it that don't follow their specific interpretation, right? So like if you were opposed to them, You might subscribe to an opposing view. You might be persuaded, or you might, if you agreed with them already, like if you had a prior disposition, you might just automatically agree with them.
Yeah,
but there's nothing demonstrating that there's like an understanding of this this complex issue.
Iron, what are one of the solves to a rule following?
That seems like a big like digression, Yuri.
Just give me the best.
That seems like a big kind of left step.
Just remember he said that and ask him another time.
No, I'm saying it's coherent to what Shamos is saying, right? Because if you were authentically concerned about resolving the rule following argument,
to what Shamos is saying.
I'm saying it's relevant, right? Because if you were sincerely determined to find the answer to that problem, right, you might find any number of these different solves, right? But the idea that you would find just coincidentally the one that was put forward to you by the person that introduced you to the problem suggests that it's more likely that you were just subscribing to their view because of some kind of personality trait and not because you had actually gone and found the answer for yourself.
Well, I've read Wittgenstein's rules in private language, right? I'm just curious, right? You say that there are several solves to the rule following argument, but which one was the best one? And can you show how it solves the rule following paradigm?
No, this is.
Wait, can you even explain to us? Because I bet Iron couldn't.
No, see, this is just a diversion. I think the point that Shamos has been trying to bring up the whole time makes sense, right? Like very often when people regurgitate Jack's view on an issue, I mean they'll repeat it chapter and verse, right? It's not even the case that they just agree with Jack; they agree with Jack entirely in every aspect of the view. And I think it's fair to say that it's relatively unlikely.
Why are you doing
this? They agree with him in his personality. They copy his mannerisms, like where Jack says right after every verse. After every verse, I said verse on purpose because it's like what Jack says is like Holy Scripture, you know. But like after everything they say, they got to say right, and they even copy him down to his mannerism. So you really think that? Let me ask you a question. Do you think that every fucking 2 sentences in the philosophical literature it said right? Is that what you think? You think every 2 sentences in the philosophical literature it said right? And the reason why Pogan always says right is because of the philosophical literature.
Shamos, that's just a silly thing to bring up.
Yeah. Shamos says right. That's the funny thing. So Shamos is a Jack puppet.
Right.
Oh, that's right. Didn't he say like he had to like change himself out of that?
Yeah, I'm just curious, Shamos. Can you provide an argument for why? Because correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Can you explain to us or give us an argument for why we should believe that some of us who say right got that from listening?
Yuri, like, what the fuck are you doing?
Oh, I was just asking.
What is it with black people asking where they're going?
I mean, given my background knowledge, right? I mean, there might be some other facts that I'm amiss to that might be reason to explain why you copy Jack's mannerisms and how he says things. But look, given the experience that I have, okay, and given the buddy and the causal history, I think it's the top explanation on the table so far. Okay, given my knowledge, like I couldn't offer anything even close, right? Like maybe fucking Yuri's uncle was like got hit in the head with a hammer and he just said right all the time, or like maybe there's some cartoon or a fucking Japanese anime that I'm unaware of that always says right, even if that were the case, I think even if I knew that, if I knew, there was still more likely that it would be Jack. So I just don't even know what would be an alternate.
It's just stupid.
Sorry, yeah, we shouldn't. Cam's right. We shouldn't do this. It's just like Shamos is trying to blow you.
So the part that I'm interested in is, like, it is pretty clear to me that Jack has had a lot of influence over people in this community. And like there are different ways of thinking about that influence. Like I think Shamos, you're wanting to present it in like a really negative light. It's almost as if you hold the presumption that the individual reasoner when encountering Jack shouldn't have changed their position. But like perhaps a different view that we could offer is just that we are like these kind of, we are running into different people and being exposed to different subsets of information. And it is the case that like when the subset of information or the argument that you get exposed to with Jack, you're actually rationally justified in shifting your position with him on the basis of what is presented. You might be right, Shamos, that like if that individual actor then went later on and got a wider scope of philosophy, his credence in Jack's view might be low. You might be right about that claim, but to me it seems that you are also saying that they are wrong to be influenced by him, and like the fact that they are being influenced is some kind of negative. And I'm not sure if I follow that, because it just sort of seems to be like the same thing we're exposed to any information. Like, for example, read an article, right? And I'm convinced by the evidence that's presented in the article and convinced by its reasoning. And like, we don't hold the view that I should just suspend complete judgment proposition until I've gone sourced a wider array of literature. Like, we allow for to be shifted just on reading that article. And it seems like that would also apply with respect to Jack, without needing to characterize active Yuri and Pogan as being some kind of dick-sucking, irrational agents.
Possible. I think it's possible, but it's just unlikely given the complexity of these arguments. Like, some of these arguments are so complex that it's possible that the literature is so good that it brought him to Jack's position. But not only is the literature complex, some of the ways they solves it aren't readily obvious. Like, for example, if you go look at what Kripke in the paper, right? He actually goes and kind of offers like argument by elimination. He kind of like sketches some good candidates for him, and basically like the non-natural property was not even mentioned or barely mentioned, and it seems to be people want to cash it out and like facts about cultures or natural language or something like that. There's all these responses. The fact that you sit there and say the argument goes through, it's a defeater, that it can't be cashed out in anything, some natural property, so it's a non-natural property, and that's like literally one of the more non-obvious complex solves to that problem. And you're gonna lead me to expect that it's more likely that a philosophical novice like Pogan came to that solve, okay, based on the literature. It just doesn't seem like
that isn't what I was saying, Shamos. In fact, what I was saying just then is like, I want to like view Pogan as a rational agent who was exposed to a subset of information and reasoning and was rationally justified in shifting his view as a result of that. But that you also might be right that if he went and pursued a wider range of literature on the topic, that he might actually lose credence. So I'm saying that like your negative characterization of might not be ought not be judged in virtue of Jack's influence, but instead Pogan's like failure to do what you might consider epistemic duty of reading widely. Because I think that like you don't want to.
You didn't contact anything I said. I just said, do you think it's more likely that a philosophical novice is going to come to one of the least obvious complex solves for a very, very complex argument, like the rule following argument and the non-natural response? You think that it's likely that a philosophical novice would come to that type of non-obvious response on a complex argument? Or do you think that...
I mean, of course, I think that like it's because he's heard it from Jack.
No, but I think what best explains it is... if left to his own devices, so if we think that the literature is the best explanation for why he has those views, then I think what that would kind of entail is if he just had the literature or whatever he read, that he would have came to those views. And that's just what it means to say.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't really entertaining that hypothetical, because I don't know. Maybe was I meant to be entertaining that hypothetical? No, I just sort of took it as something kind of silly.
It's a weird shoehorn.
I was more interested in the conversation about whether like Pogan was doing something wrong by like finding an argument that Jake gave compelling. And it seemed to me that your judgment was like somehow like a negative characterization of him as like as a person.
I think he was trying to insinuate that he doesn't think for himself to some degree.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. And I'm saying that's not a good way to approach philosophy. To come in without the tools, inadequately able to
right, but we're all learners and process.
Don't even have philosophical tools or distinctions or divisions to even know how to combat these things, you know? And like then you come in, you get rolled over, okay, and then you're like, yep, that's my view, you know? And then it's only in the virtue of your ignorance that's your view now, you know?
So
And
I think the thing that you
that's
should be focusing on, like, whether a person continues to hold that view for like some kind of extended period of time without ever going finding out whether there are competing views that are worth investigating. Like, because it might be like we're all learners of this, and we have limited time that we have to investigate them. And like, you think that like Pogan's epistemic duty is to be influenced by Jack and read all the literature and find out whether. Sorry, I just got to. Yeah. Anyway, like, I agree with you that Jack is. I think that makes complete sense to me. But I just don't really see like why you make such an issue of it.
Like, to be honest with you, I'm kind of surprised this was met with so much criticism. Like, I thought this would be pretty
because you
uncontroversial.
started by being an asshole about it. You kind of started
I'm just
by...
saying, I thought this would be uncontroversial. I'm actually kind of curious. Like, where do most people lie on the side of this issue? I propose that we make a straw poll and ask, what do people honestly think is a better explanation for why Pogan has all of Jack's views? He just read the right literature and came to it on his own, or Jack bent him to his will? And I would love to know what most people think. Can we create that straw poll? Because like I don't really have anything more to say about the argument. Like I don't want to keep rehashing or whatever. Like if you have other points to bring up, I'll listen to them. But I'm actually curious what you guys think. What do you think,
He
Jovan?
obviously doesn't mean every single view. That's just like nobody interprets what he said that way. Does anybody?
Don't be ridiculous.
I don't know why we're white knighting for Shamos. Shamos.
What if
Don't
he
be
does get
ridiculous.
some of his views from Jack, right? Like, what if there
Don't
is
be
like
ridiculous. That's not what I meant. Don't be ridiculous.
Wait, hold on. I have a question though. After.
Yeah, like what if there's like the
How
majority
many
of his
views do you think he shares with Jack?
Yeah, and which of those views do you think are going to be attributed to Jack or to the literature?
Yeah, so like this was the question I want to ask, or I'm going to pose it this way, right? If we're going to divide it up into views, right? If we were to create a fraction, right, and we had I guess we could. How should we? A fraction or a ratio? It doesn't matter, right? If we were to say, let's just tally it up, right? If we were to have on one side Jack's views, right, and we have on the other side views that Pogan adopted that are the same as Jack's, but Pogan came to that conclusion because he read the literature, right? What if we see one tally mark or 1 point for like the left side, right? And that's for like him directly being bent by Jack's will, right? Or we have on the other side like 10 tally marks for like Pogan coming to it on his own, right? If we were to come to that, would that falsify Shamos' hypothesis? Almost? Because it seems to me, right, if we were to break it up that way and we were to show how Pogan was to have some views of Jack's, but on the other side, the most of his views, right, came from, doing his own research. What would that show then, Shamos? If we were to find that?
Yeah, that would falsify my view, bro.
Oh, okay, you would accept that? Okay, cool. I just wanted to make that clear because I think that's a key point. If we were able to do that.
Well, I'm saying that's the opposite of my claim. So yeah, if that was true, you'd falsify my view. Like if you could prove.
What if and just real quick, this is the last question. What if they came out as equal? What if we figured out that all the views that were on the left side were equal to all the views on the right side? What would that do to your hypothesis?
I would concede. I was incorrect. If that was
okay, cool. Let's move on then.
All right, let's do the straw poll. Let's do the straw poll because I'm really fucking curious. I figured this would be super uncontroversial.
What is it? What is the straw poll of?
Straw poll is which is more likely that all the views that philosophical views that Pogan shares with Jack, that he acquired the majority of those views by being A, bent to Jack's will, or B, consulting the literature and coming to it on his own conclusion. And I just want to know what people think, because I think it's going to be a landslide. Like, most people are going to be like, so obviously.
I think you might want to say it's like refined.
Someone has to do that for me. I don't do that shit.
That's what I mean by the framing, though, Shamos. Because, like, bent to Jack's will, it sort of just negates any like involvement of him as a rational agent. Like, and it's instead like some type of conversion. I couldn't agree to that view.
I think people generally get what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so like, maybe drop the rhetoric.
I think you'd want to specify like refined views, though, right? Like he might have a predisposition towards socialism, but might be pushed towards Marxist-Leninism because of his experience with Jack, for example.
Anyway, it's an interesting. I have to go now, but it's an interesting topic, Shamos. Like how there are community influences and whether or not individuals in the community think that they have like influences that are, not rationally justified. Or an interesting topic.
You want to know something really weird before you go, Cam? The hierarchies, because of the nature of this community, the fact that it's a debate community and kind of most of the traits in order to be like considered like a good debater or like good in this community or whatever, has to do with like, your intellect and stuff like that. And what you'll find is these weird hierarchies develop. I noticed this thing that, like Vic, right, who's really smart, knows his shit, blah, 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 blah. He had like literally some of the hottest girls on Discord, like chasing him around and like riding his balls, because the power of these hierarchies is centered around like intellectual, philosophical knowledge and stuff like that. And so what's happening is hot girls even understood the power structure and were trying to play the game. Like only in this type of environment would those girls ever care about, Vic on that level, etc. And what I'm saying is
hypothesis.
I'm saying I didn't mean to say it like that. That's a little brash. You get the general notion.
He's a good looking.
What explains me, Shamos?
Not saying he's not a good guy, but you get the general notion of what I'm saying. Yeah, I said that not very politically correct. You guys are going to jump out of your seat because I didn't say that politically correct. But you get the main thrust. You get the main thrust of what I'm saying. It's more disproportional than what he would get representative unrelative to that power structure. Okay, maybe that's a little better said. And the idea is this: all I'm trying to put a highlight on is that the power dynamic and the way that it influences people is all centered around intellectual and philosophical knowledge and dominance. And when you look at Jack, that's what they specialize in. So why wouldn't it be obvious, given the structure of that hierarchy, that's the people? Most people are getting bent to their will. It just seems obvious.
Good night, folks. Nice talking with you,
Night,
Shamos.
Cam.
You don't want to hear the incel post? All right, good night.
I love you all.
Yeah, I would go in on Iron, but JJ is now active, so I don't feel.
Yeah, when did that?
I don't want to hear like stuff in the background, like what, why, like when we talk about like stuff that's completely obvious, So.
Wait, what are you going to go in? What are you going to go in on me on?
Excuse. Yeah, it's just a terrible
excuse.
Well,
I don't think I could say since JJ's right here.
Are you going to try and pester me about that? Are you going to try and pester me about that rule following thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to see if you even know what the paradox even is before again.
No, I'm sure.
Not only what the paradox is, but what the goal of the argument is to show.
Wait, is it a paradox or
Iron about?
Just clarify. Is it a paradox or an argument?
Look, I'm fine. I'm fine with
Yuri, abort. Yuri, abort.
Why?
I assume people have given Ken a bunch of shit already for coming back at all.
Just because everyone in like Holy or wherever says Iron's an idiot doesn't mean that you're gonna crush him.
Oh, I don't think Iron's an idiot. I just think he's dishonest, right? And I think he's
Fine, proceed.
What am I dishonest about?
At your own risk, bud.
Why would you start with the rule following argument? Isn't Iron still a fascist?
Well, he made a claim. No, he made a claim a while ago regarding the rule following.
Wait.
Iron, are you still a fascist?
I want to hear that line of reasoning. Isn't he still a fascist? Why would you go?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Like, aren't there more interesting things to talk to him about that are relevant to his interests?
There's nothing really interesting about Iron.
I'm not very good at politics.
It's like, imagine, okay, you have a clean shot.
Fascism is boring.
You have a clean shot at World War II. what are you going to say to Hitler? Instead of shaking him out or arguing with him, you're going to say, oh, do you know about the rule following argument?
Yeah, nobody cares about that bullshit, right? We've been over that a million times.
Yeah, let's let Yuri talk to Iron about the rule
following. Have you looked at the rule following argument? Like, how many do you think exist to it?
How
many solutions?
Well, I think they're attempted. I don't think they're actually. I think the question that you just asked me presupposes that they're solutions. I think they're attempted solutions.
No, but I mean, like, obviously,
This is just
in philosophy, people have disagreements that oftentimes can't be resolved, right? But they think that they've solved it with some kind of like argument or position, right? So I'm saying, how many proposed solutions do you think exist to it?
You want me to pull up like a natural? You want me to just like pull up like some sort of metric or like number?
Listen, bud. I'm not the executioner. I'm here to kill you, right? I'm just asking genuinely, how many do you think exist? I'm not here to like put you on the spot and fucking get you.
Doesn't matter.
Right. No, I understand. I understand that. Right. I'm just not understanding the question. So I guess if you just want to put like a number on it, I can just say like 5. I've came across like 5 or 10, maybe somewhere in that range, especially in this room, and from what I read.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Some are more sophisticated. Some are more sophisticated than, obviously.
Yeah. So what's the problem with that then?
What's the problem?
Well, if there's like 5,
You're
if there's
supposed to
5
explain
plus
the rule
solutions,